The ballroom pulsed with strings and crystal light, every corner dripping with wealth and promises wrapped in white lace. For 26-year-old Jade, it was just another shift spent balancing trays and swallowing dreams. Her sneakers stuck to polished marble floors as she slipped past guests sipping champagne like oxygen. Then she saw it. Not the cake or the groom or the blur of $1 million kiss. The ring, rose gold, emerald cut, a ghost on the bride's finger. Her world tilted. That ring had vanished 10 years ago, with someone Jade had never stopped searching for, and now, without warning, it was staring back at her across a sea of silk and lies. The ballroom shimmered like a dream built for someone else's life. Crystal chandeliers spilled diamonds across polished marble floors, and golden cutlery gleamed atop ivory linens, while laughter floated above the hum of a string quartet, weaving Vivaldi into the air like silk. Jade moved through it all like a shadow. Her black shoes squeaked softly with every step, and the tray balanced on her shoulder was heavier than usual, though she was used to the weight. 26 years old and still invisible in places like this. Each polite nod to a guest, and every muttered apology as she weaved between tables felt rehearsed 1,000 times. Her name tag caught on the edge of a chair. Her mind flickered back to mornings that smelled like cinnamon rolls and old perfume. Mia's perfume. Her older sister. The girl who used to paint Jade's nails and promised to take her to Paris when they both got out of that tiny apartment in Queens. But that never happened, because one day Mia was gone, just vanished. Her purse found near the East River. Nothing else. No answers. No goodbye. Jade blinked it away, focused on the next table. Another champagne refill, another napkin straightened. She moved like muscle memory through a world that wasn't built for her. The laughter was louder at the sweetheart table, the bride in white satin, the groom in a tux that probably cost more than Jade made in a month. She wondered what that kind of love felt like, or if it was ever real. Her feet ached, her back throbbed. Her smile was a mask carved by years of survival. One more hour, maybe 2. Then she could go home. Ramen, sleep, silence. She wondered what Mia would think of her now, still stuck, still waiting tables, still looking over her shoulder for a ghost. Every time she passed a certain type of man in a crowd, her stomach clenched. Every time she saw a ring that looked a little too familiar, her heart dared to hope. Stupid. Hope was useless. Hope was cruel. Her manager waved at her from across the ballroom. Keep moving. Table 12 needs wine. The couple near the balcony dropped a fork. A child cried. A bridesmaid tripped. The ballroom sparkled, but Jade felt none of it. She was watching life happen from behind glass, and in that moment nothing about this night felt different. It was just another shift. Another evening of pretending not to feel the weight of what was missing. Another night of forgetting who she used to be before the world took Mia and never explained why. So she adjusted her tray, lifted her chin, took a breath, and stepped back into the light. It happened in a breath. 1 second Jade was adjusting a champagne flute near the sweetheart table, and the next her gaze landed on the bride's hand, and her world lurched sideways. The ring caught the light just right. A soft gleam of rose gold around an emerald-cut diamond, with a filigree so delicate it could have been lace spun from memory. Her breath hitched. Her fingers froze around the silver stem of the flute. That ring. Not a ring like it. That ring. Her knees locked and her throat closed, and for a moment the ballroom noise disappeared behind the rushing of blood in her ears. Mia's ring. The one their mother had stared at through tears for months after the disappearance. the one the police never recovered, the one Mia never took off before the day she vanished. Jade swallowed hard. She blinked twice. But the ring remained. It wrapped itself around the bride's finger like a noose pulled tight around the past. Her tray trembled slightly as she lowered it to the linen-covered table. She could feel her heart pounding beneath her uniform like it was trying to break free. She glanced again. The filigree, the shape, the slight curve at the base of the setting. Every detail was burned into her memory. Mia used to let her try it on in their bedroom when she thought no one was watching. She had dreamed of having something like it someday. Now here it was, on the hand of a stranger, at a wedding that had nothing to do with her. Or did it? Her fingers gripped the tray tighter. She looked at the groom, a polished man in his 30s with a jawline too perfect to be real and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Something inside her screamed, but her voice was still buried under disbelief. She told herself she had to be wrong, that it was just a copy, that no one could know, but her gut said otherwise. Her gut said this was it. Her gut said everything was about to change. The music floated gently through the air again. She stepped backward slowly, then turned. The tray was empty now, her hands free, but she wasn't. She made her way to the staff entrance at the edge of the ballroom and leaned against the wall where no one could see her face. Her skin was clammy, her breaths shallow. She closed her eyes, and the image of the ring flashed again. Her sister's laugh, her sister's goodbye. The way her mother sat in the dark for weeks after the police stopped calling. She had to be sure. She had to know. Because if that really was Mia's ring, then someone here had lied. And if someone had lied, then someone knew. And if someone knew, then the past wasn't finished with them yet. Jade's feet moved before her brain caught up. The tray was gone. The staff hallway blurred behind her. Her pulse thudded in her throat like a warning bell. But she kept walking. Past the champagne towers and the string quartet still playing their polished lies, toward the sweetheart table where the bride sat laughing gently with her new husband, or maybe pretending to. Caroline. That was her name, Caroline Brooks. Jade had heard the planner say it a dozen times while arranging centerpieces and dessert carts. She looked too perfect, too untouched. Jade hesitated behind a pillar, her breath unsteady, her heart ricocheting in her chest. She didn't want to do this. She didn't want to risk it. But what if she walked away? What if that ring really was Mia's and she let it slip through her fingers? Again, the thought tasted like ash, so she waited until the couple was momentarily alone. No camera, no toasts, just a quiet lull between announcements. Then Jade stepped forward. She kept her hands at her sides and her voice low, her eyes locked on the ring. She spoke gently, but her words cracked under the weight of years. She said she was sorry to interrupt, but she had to ask, where did the bride get that ring? Caroline blinked, surprised, then confused. Jade told her it looked exactly like the one her sister wore 10 years ago before she disappeared. Caroline frowned and said the ring was a family heirloom. Jade's breath faltered, but she pressed on, her voice trembling now. She said there was a detail only 2 people knew. On the inside of the band was a tiny engraving, a heart no bigger than a freckle, a private joke between Mia and the man she was going to marry. Caroline hesitated. Slowly she slid the ring from her finger and turned it in her palm. The moment she saw the engraving, her face drained of color. For a long second no one spoke. Jade stared. Caroline's hand trembled. The groom turned toward them with a polite smile that vanished the moment he saw Caroline's expression. Jade's skin prickled. Her blood ran cold. Caroline looked at Jade, then at her fiancé, then back at the ring like it had burned her. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The silence between them was louder than the music still playing in the background. Finally, Caroline whispered one word, "How?" And Jade just shook her head because she didn't know. She had spent 10 years asking that same question, and now here it was glittering under chandelier light and clutched in a stranger's hand. The groom's smile reappeared, but it was brittle. He asked if everything was all right. Caroline didn't answer. Her eyes never left the engraving. Jade could feel it. The moment the world began to shift, the moment truth started to rise like smoke from beneath their perfect white lies. She had said the words. She had broken the surface, and nothing could ever go back to the way it was. The music faltered as Caroline stood, the hem of her silk gown whispering against the marble floor, her face pale as if the chandelier light had drained into her skin. The guests kept laughing for a moment longer, unaware that the heart of the celebration had just flatlined. Then a ripple began, a murmur that passed from table to table like a warning wind before a storm. Jade stepped back into the shadows, her chest tight, her hands cold. Caroline didn't look at her again. She was staring at Ethan now, her fiancé, her almost husband, the man who had slid that ring onto her finger with a smile he had practiced in mirrors, his brows furrowed with just the right amount of confusion and concern as he asked what was going on. But Caroline's voice trembled when she said it. She asked him where the ring had come from, not where he claimed it was from, where it really came from. Ethan laughed softly. The sound was a little too late, a little too smooth. He said it was his grandmother's, a family piece. One he'd kept hidden away until the perfect moment. Caroline's lips pressed into a line, her hands clenched at her sides. She said nothing, just lifted the ring again and turned it toward the light. Her eyes never left his face. Jade watched from the edge of the ballroom, barely breathing. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move, because something was happening. Because the air had shifted, because Mia's story was no longer buried beneath time and silence. Ethan's voice grew sharper. He said the waitress was mistaken, that she was probably confused, or worse. Caroline shook her head. She said Jade knew about the engraving. She said no one could guess that. Ethan's mouth twitched, just once. Then his smile returned. He said people make things up, especially people who want attention, especially people who are desperate. That word hit Jade like a slap. Desperate. He said it too quickly, too easily, like he'd used it before. Caroline's eyes glistened, her lips parted, but no sound came out. The guests were turning now, watching, sensing something cracking beneath the surface of their perfect night. The string quartet stopped playing. The silence became thunderous. Caroline whispered to Ethan again, her voice barely audible, but Jade saw the way his jaw tightened, his nostrils flared. It was enough. The mask was slipping, and whatever he was hiding behind it was dark and deep and possibly dangerous. Jade's heart pounded. She looked at the faces around her, confused, curious, hungry for gossip, but this wasn't gossip. This was a warning bell finally ringing. This was a lie unraveling in real time. And in the center of it all stood the man who had smiled his way into a life he might have stolen piece by piece, starting with a ring, starting with Mia. Ethan's fingers brushed his cufflink with an ease that tried too hard to look effortless, as he repeated the lie one more time, telling Caroline that the ring was a Monroe family heirloom, passed down from his grandmother to his mother and now to her. His voice was calm, but his eyes flickered too much, and Jade could see the shift behind his gaze like someone scrambling to remember the story they rehearsed. Caroline didn't blink. Her shoulders remained stiff, her hand still holding the ring like it was suddenly foreign and toxic. She asked him quietly, almost tenderly, if he was absolutely sure that was where it came from. Her tone was soft, but the space between them had turned sharp. Ethan nodded with a smile that was supposed to be reassuring, but instead looked rehearsed and mechanical. He added that this whole moment was probably just a sad coincidence, that people grieve in strange ways, and maybe Jade had projected something onto the ring because of her loss. Caroline's eyes shimmered, but not with belief. Her fingers closed around the ring. She said Jade mentioned the engraving before she saw it. How would she have known that? Ethan's smile cracked for a second. A flicker. He covered it quickly by reaching for her hand and saying it didn't matter where the ring came from. What mattered was their future. But Caroline stepped back. Just one step. Subtle but seismic. The energy between them twisted. Guests were starting to lean in. Whisper. Phones lifted like vultures circling confusion. Jade stayed frozen at the edge of it all. She didn't trust herself to speak, to breathe, to believe this was really happening. Ethan dropped his voice to a murmur Jade couldn't hear, but Caroline's expression didn't soften. It turned distant, almost like she was calculating the cost of everything she didn't want to see. Her silence now felt louder than any scream. Then she looked at Jade, just for a moment, not in fear, not in anger, but in recognition. The acknowledgement that something real had just shattered the carefully curated fiction around her. Ethan tried again. He said they should step outside, that this was their moment and they shouldn't let anyone ruin it. But the way he said ruin sounded too pointed. Caroline didn't move. She asked one more time where he got the ring, and this time Ethan didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, he exhaled through his nose. Slow, controlled. Then he said she was overreacting, that the timing was just unfortunate, that this girl's trauma had nothing to do with them. But Jade heard it clearly now. The way he said this girl, detached, dismissive, like someone who had erased people before. Caroline heard it too. Something behind her eyes broke. She turned toward the officiant, who was still standing near the altar, confused, unsure whether to speak. She looked at the guests, then back at Ethan. Her hand clenched tight around the ring, and though she didn't say it aloud, yet Jade felt it coming like a storm on the horizon. This wedding was already over. Jade didn't wait to see what happened next. Her hands were shaking, and her breath came in sharp bursts as she slipped back through the side hallway, away from the shimmering chandeliers and the hush that had fallen over the ballroom like a silk curtain tearing at the seams. She burst into the staff corridor where the hum of old vents and clatter of dishes couldn't drown out the pounding in her ears. Her back hit the wall, and she slid down slowly, the cold tile pressing through her thin uniform as her thoughts spun like a broken carousel. She had done it. She had said it out loud. The thing she had carried for 10 years like a stone in her chest. The thing no one believed or wanted to hear. She closed her eyes and saw the ring again, the light catching the filigree, the tiny heart like a whisper from a life that had been ripped away. Part of her wanted to run, to leave through the service entrance and disappear back into the city's noise and forget she had ever stepped into that glittering lie of a wedding. But she couldn't, not now. Not after Caroline's face went pale. Not after Ethan's story cracked like cheap glass under heat. This wasn't just some rich man's mistake. It wasn't just a duplicate ring. That heart engraving proved it. Mia's ring hadn't been lost in the river or pawned by a stranger. It was here, tonight, on the bride's hand. Jade tried to calm her breathing. She remembered her mother crying in the dark, remembered the detectives with tired eyes saying the trail had gone cold, remembered lighting candles every year on the anniversary and still clinging to the impossible hope that Mia would just walk through the door. And now, somehow, her story had surfaced in the middle of someone else's fairy tale. She dug her phone out of her apron pocket. Hands trembling, she pulled up the folder of photos she never deleted. There it was. Mia's hand, the ring shining against soft skin, her nails painted gold for some party they never went to. Jade stared at it, the proof she hadn't imagined it all. She needed to do something. Say something. But what? Would the police believe her now? Would they reopen the file that had sat untouched for years? Would Caroline stand by her, or would she be swept back into denial once Ethan found the words to charm her again? Jade pressed her hand to her chest, tried to steady the storm inside. She had cracked the silence, but the real question was whether the truth would hold or slip away again, like it always had. No one had come back here looking for her yet. No manager asking what she said. No police asking what she knew. It was still hers to carry, for now. And if no one came, she would go back out there. Not as a waitress, not as a girl waiting to be dismissed, but as a sister. And if this was the start of something unraveling, then she was ready to pull every single thread. The music had stopped completely now, and an eerie stillness hung in the air, like everyone in the ballroom was holding their breath at once. Jade returned quietly, standing just beyond the archway where the kitchen met the main hall, and what she saw made her heart knock against her ribs. Caroline was standing alone near the center of the room, her veil pulled back and her hand still curled tightly around the ring, like it was some artifact that might burn her if she let go. Her parents hovered nearby, confused, whispering urgently, but she didn't answer them. She looked only at Ethan, who was trying to keep his smile in place, but the charm was peeling like cheap paint. Caroline turned toward the crowd and raised a hand. The room began to hush. A few people still murmured, but the energy shifted, like everyone sensed something sacred had snapped. Her voice was clear, though not loud, and it carried not with force but with finality. She said she was sorry, that she couldn't go through with the wedding, that something had come to light that she couldn't ignore. The words fell into the silence like stones into water. No one spoke. A gasp here, a stifled sob there. Phones were now recording. Faces frozen in disbelief. Ethan stepped forward quickly and said they should talk outside, that this wasn't the time or place. But Caroline simply shook her head. Not angry, not hysterical, just done. Her mother tried to step in, but Caroline gently pushed her hand away and said she was making her decision. Ethan's jaw locked, and he whispered something too low to catch, but Jade saw the flicker of panic behind his eyes. The mask was slipping further, and he knew it. Caroline took off the ring and placed it on the nearest table, not carefully, not ceremoniously, just like someone putting down a lie. Then she turned and walked toward the double doors leading to the hallway, her train dragging like an afterthought behind her. Guests began to murmur again, louder now, some following, some pulling out their phones in disbelief, others rushing to comfort parents or whispering theories. Ethan stood in the middle of it all, alone for the first time that night, and Jade watched as his face twisted not in sadness but in calculation. She had seen that look before. On men who weren't sorry, only inconvenienced. Her fists curled at her sides. She could feel the moment a story broke open, the illusion shattering in real time. What started as a lavish celebration had just turned into a fracture in the foundation of someone's life, and Jade had lit the fuse. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt hollow, shaken, but not lost. Not anymore. Because for the first time in 10 years someone had believed her. Someone had looked at that ring and seen the truth inside it, and maybe, just maybe, the rest of the world would have to look now, too. Caroline's decision echoed louder than any speech could have, and not long after she disappeared down the hallway, the ballroom fell into true chaos. Guests rose from their seats like waves in a storm, some heading toward the exits, others crowding around Ethan with questions he deflected with tight smiles and clipped reassurances. But the air had turned sharp, tense. Like static before a lightning strike, Jade stayed on the edge of it all, invisible again but this time by choice, watching as the man at the center of everything tried to hold the pieces together. He was no longer the confident groom with a perfect jawline and polished shoes. His eyes darted, his smile faltered, and when Caroline's father approached him with a clenched jaw and quiet fury, Ethan raised his hands and said he needed a moment to himself. He backed away toward a corner, phone in hand, and Jade's stomach flipped. He was calling someone, or deleting something, or both. A moment later, uniformed officers stepped into the ballroom, led by one of the venue managers, and followed by Caroline herself, now without her veil, her makeup slightly smudged but her spine straighter than ever. Conversations halted. All eyes turned. One of the officers walked straight to Ethan and asked if they could speak privately. He glanced at Caroline, then at Jade, and for the briefest second his eyes landed on her like a blade. She felt the chill of it, but didn't flinch. He asked what this was about. The officer replied that there were questions concerning an ongoing missing person case connected to a ring identified earlier that evening. Ethan stiffened, said he didn't understand, that this was a wedding, not an interrogation. Caroline stepped closer and said that a woman had recognized the ring on her finger and identified it as belonging to her sister, Mia, who vanished 10 years ago. She paused, then added that Jade had described an engraving hidden on the inner band, something no stranger could guess. The officer nodded and asked Ethan to come with them to a private room to clarify a few things. Not under arrest, just a conversation. But Ethan bristled, said he wanted a lawyer present, said he wasn't going anywhere without one. His voice rose and the polished exterior cracked again, just for a moment. Then he caught himself, smoothed his suit, told the officer he would cooperate, but only within the bounds of the law. Jade's heart was pounding. She knew this moment would come. The shift from suspicion to scrutiny, from private whispers to public consequence. The weight of it filled her lungs. This wasn't a dream. The police were here. The story had cracked open wide enough for the truth to crawl out. As Ethan was led away, Jade didn't move. She stood in the shadows, silent and steady, knowing this was only the beginning. Answers wouldn't come easy, but for the first time in a decade, someone had asked the right questions. In the quiet room off the main corridor, where the noise of the ballroom was muffled by heavy oak doors and thick carpet, Jade sat across from a young female officer who offered her a bottle of water and a kind look that made her chest ache with the weight of being believed. The space smelled faintly of lavender and old paper, a strange contrast to the storm of memory crashing inside her as she recounted the story she had told only to herself for the last 10 years. She spoke slowly at first, her voice uncertain, the words catching as if she were still afraid they would be dismissed like they always had been. But then the truth began to pour out. She told them about Mia, how she had been engaged to a man no one in the family really knew, a man with money and charm and a name that didn't leave a trail. She described the way Mia had started to pull away from the family near the end, how she smiled less and locked her bedroom door and whispered phone calls late at night. How she had once shown Jade the ring with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes and said he was intense but generous. She told them about the night Mia disappeared, how her purse was found near the East River with her phone and wallet still inside, but no sign of struggle. How the police had searched and searched, but nothing ever turned up. How the man she had been engaged to vanished too. No public records, no address, just gone. The case eventually went cold, and the world moved on. But Jade hadn't, because she knew, in her gut. In the way grief carved itself into her bones, she knew something terrible had happened, and now here she was 10 years later, standing in front of a bride with that same ring wrapped around her finger like a ghost. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the old photograph she always kept with her. Mia smiling, her hand lifted to her cheek, the ring catching the sunlight. The officer examined it carefully, then asked about the engraving. Jade explained how Mia had once told her the tiny heart inside the band was a secret, something only she and her fiancé knew about. When Caroline confirmed that the heart was there, Jade had known without a doubt this was Mia's ring. She looked up and saw the officer nodding, her expression grim but focused. Everything about the atmosphere had changed. This wasn't just a story now. It was evidence. It was memory turned into motion. The officer said they would reopen the case and that they had already begun verifying Ethan's background. Jade exhaled shakily. For the first time in years, she wasn't just shouting into the dark. Her voice had landed somewhere. Someone had caught it, and now it was being carried forward into something real, something that might finally bring Mia home. The hallway outside the quiet room buzzed with low voices and the static hum of radios as a detective stepped through the door, holding a tablet and a look that said the past was no longer buried. He introduced himself and told Jade and the officers present that something had come up during the initial background sweep of Ethan Monroe that was not his original name. In fact, he had legally changed his identity almost 9 years ago, right after Mia disappeared. Before that, he had gone by another name in Connecticut, and under that identity he had been engaged to a woman named Mia Brooks. Jade felt the breath leave her body as if someone had pulled the air straight from her lungs. The detective continued without dramatic flair, just the weight of facts crashing down like falling bricks. The engagement was quiet, no public announcements, but neighbors from that time remembered a woman matching Mia's description. When she vanished, he told police he hadn't seen her in weeks and claimed she might have run off. Nothing was proven, and soon after, he disappeared himself. The name change happened months later, and he resurfaced as Ethan Monroe, tech entrepreneur, startup genius, media darling. The detective glanced at Jade and said her instincts had been correct. This man had buried more than just a name. Jade gripped the edge of the chair to steady herself as her mind reeled. It had always been him, all these years. He had walked free, rebuilt a new life, charmed a new woman, bought a new ring. No, not new. The same ring, a symbol of possession, repackaged as love. The thought made her sick. The detective then explained they had already pulled property records, tax filings, travel history. There were gaps, windows of time when he was off the grid, enough to raise suspicion, more than enough to warrant deeper investigation. The officer beside Jade asked if there had ever been a formal search of his previous residence. The detective shook his head. Not at the time. There had been no evidence of a crime back then, only absence. But now the case was different. Now there was a connection, a name, a ring, a lie that stretched back a decade and ended with a bride walking away at the altar. Jade couldn't speak. Her thoughts spun through memories like leaves caught in wind. Mia in her favorite sweater, Mia humming in the kitchen, Mia holding that ring and saying it felt too good to be true. Now Jade understood what she meant. The detective placed the tablet down and said they would need Caroline's statement next, and then they would request a warrant. Jade nodded slowly. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears, but underneath it was something steadier. A quiet flame, the kind that grows in the presence of truth. Ethan had been found, the mask was slipping, and the cold case file that once gathered dust was now the hottest lead in the department. Jade stepped out of the precinct the next morning with the city's cold breath curling around her neck and a weight in her chest that wouldn't lift no matter how far she walked from the station. The sky above was pale and indifferent, but her hands were burning as she clutched the envelope filled with photocopies and notes, pieces of Mia's life scattered across time and paper. She hadn't slept. After hours of questions and statements and cross-referencing records, she had gone home to her small apartment, but found no rest there. Instead, she pulled down the old shoebox from the top of her closet, where she had kept every postcard, photo, and scribbled note her sister had ever given her. It had become a shrine over the years, a quiet rebellion against forgetting. Now she dumped the contents onto her worn couch and began sifting through memories with new eyes. There were photos of Mia at 25, beaming with a confidence that Jade had always admired. A few torn journal pages Mia had once mailed her from upstate, full of poetry and strange metaphors. One of them mentioned a place called Tarry Hollow. Jade paused. That name had meant nothing at the time, but now it buzzed with eerie relevance. She pulled out an old birthday card, and on the back was a sketch. A small house. The same filigree pattern that had been on the ring traced along the window frames. Jade's chest tightened. These were breadcrumbs she hadn't known how to follow before. She picked up her phone and searched for Tarry Hollow, a small, quiet town in the Hudson Valley. Too quiet. She found a listing for a cabin there purchased under Ethan's old name just months before Mia disappeared. Her fingers trembled as she copied the address onto a sticky note. She didn't know if the police had this yet. Maybe they would find it eventually. But she couldn't wait. Something told her this was the place. This was where something had happened. Her stomach churned. She wasn't trained for this. She was a waitress with aching feet and a heart full of ghosts. But none of that mattered. Mia had left a trail. Not a loud one, a hidden one. And Jade had finally learned how to see it. She packed the note, Mia's journal pages, the photo of the ring, and a flashlight into her bag. She told herself she was only going to drive by, to see. But part of her already knew that wasn't true. She couldn't sit still. Not anymore. There was something waiting in that cabin. Truth, answers, maybe closure, or maybe more questions. Either way, she had spent 10 years trapped in silence and now she had a direction, a place, a lead, and a fire that would not go out. The detective's office pulsed with quiet urgency as a team of officers gathered around a digital map glowing across the table, and Jade stood in the corner gripping her coat like armor as she watched the investigation take its next breath. They had listened when she mentioned Tarry Hollow, had taken the journal pages from Mia and matched them against Ethan's property records, and within an hour they confirmed it. A secluded rental cabin purchased under his old name just 4 months before Mia vanished. It had been transferred out of his hands not long after, buried beneath shell companies, but the timeline was damning. The detective pointed at the location, a red dot in the middle of heavy woods with no visible neighbors nearby, and said it was enough for a search warrant. Jade's heart beat like a drum inside her chest as the pieces clicked into place. The address, the isolation, the timing. This was where Mia had gone, maybe where she had last been seen, maybe where she had tried to run. Caroline sat beside Jade now, pale and silent but present, her role in the unraveling undeniable. The officers were speaking in clipped phrases, using terms like potential crime scene and cold file activation. The lead investigator mentioned they would move at first light. That evidence degraded fast in the elements, but if anything remained, they would find it. Jade stared at the screen while the words swirled around her. The blue lines of roads winding through woods, the dot that had no business being there, the house where her sister had vanished from time and memory. She felt something shift inside her, not just grief this time, but fury. All those years, Ethan had lived freely, celebrated, adored by people who never saw the shadows in his past. He had built a life on top of someone else's grave and called it love. And now, finally, the world was starting to peel back the layers. One of the officers approached and asked if she could describe the last few weeks before Mia disappeared in as much detail as possible. Jade nodded. She spoke about the phone calls, the way Mia's voice had changed, the way she had sounded rushed, scared, but trying not to show it. She remembered one call where Mia had said she was thinking of leaving him but didn't know how, that she felt watched, that he had a temper. But then she laughed it off and changed the subject. Jade never heard from her again. The officer scribbled notes. Every sentence pulled a decade of silence into motion. When they finally broke for the evening, the detective told Jade she didn't have to come to the site, that they would keep her informed, but Jade looked him straight in the eye and said she was going. If Mia had been there, if her truth still lingered in that cabin, then Jade would not let anyone else face it first. This was her fight now, her sister, her story, and she would see it through. Ethan sat in the interview room like a man rehearsing patience rather than panic. His hands folded neatly on the table, his expression measured down to the curve of his mouth. The officers had stopped asking questions after he requested legal representation, and now he waited with the quiet arrogance of someone used to controlling the room. But Jade watched through the glass from the adjoining observation space and saw the shifts, the way his eyes twitched toward the corners of the ceiling, the way his jaw clenched every time the door opened even slightly. He was unraveling slowly, not with outbursts but with cracks along the surface. The detective beside her explained that his legal team had arrived and were buying time, delaying the inevitable. They had enough circumstantial evidence now to justify further questioning, but not yet to arrest. The video footage from the venue showed Ethan watching Jade intently after her confrontation with Caroline. subtle but telling. His phone history was being analyzed. There were gaps, deletions, calls to unregistered numbers. Financials were coming next. Jade listened as the detective laid out the next steps, but her attention remained fixed on Ethan. He was no longer the polished groom from the wedding, not the charming entrepreneur from the magazines. He looked smaller now, hunched slightly, the corners of his tailored shirt wrinkling as the minutes dragged on. Caroline entered the room then, accompanied by a liaison. Her face was calm, but cold. Her eyes locked on Ethan with a distance that no longer carried love or confusion, only clarity. She sat across from him and placed the ring on the table. The one he had given her, the one he had claimed, was his grandmother's. She didn't speak at first, just looked at him, and when she did speak, her voice was soft but unshakable. She asked one question: "Why did you lie?" Ethan tried to smile, to spin something about confusion and coincidence, but Caroline cut him off. She told him Jade had shown her a photo of her sister wearing that same ring 10 years ago. She told him about the engraving. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. His lawyer tried to interject, but Caroline didn't stop. She said Mia's name out loud, said it like a verdict. Ethan's fingers twitched, his jaw tightened, and for a moment the silence stretched so thin the air itself felt heavy. Then Ethan leaned back and said flatly that Mia had left him, that she had problems, that she was unstable and ran off and never came back. He claimed he had loved her but couldn't stop her from disappearing. Caroline asked if he had reported her missing. He didn't answer, just stared. The detective watching from beside Jade scribbled something in his notes. Ethan had finally spoken Mia's name, not as a stranger, as someone he knew, and in doing so he crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The evidence came not with a dramatic reveal, but in the quiet click of a corrupted file finally opening on a recovered hard drive. One of Ethan's older backups, retrieved from a forgotten storage unit under his former alias. The digital forensic team had pulled it during a deeper sweep of his past residences, and buried among spreadsheets and startup drafts was a short, grainy video clip with a timestamp from over 9 years ago. The moment the frame loaded, Jade felt her knees weaken. Mia's face appeared, dimly lit by a single lamp in what looked like a wooden interior. Her voice trembled as she spoke directly to the camera, saying she didn't feel safe and that if anything happened to her, someone needed to know the truth. She said she had met a man who wasn't who he claimed to be. She didn't name him, but she described things Jade recognized: his expensive gifts, the remote cabin in the woods, the moments of charm that turned suddenly cold. Then she mentioned the ring. Said if anything happened to her, that ring would be proof. She paused and held it up to the camera. The rose gold shimmered faintly, the same filigree, the same emerald cut. She whispered that inside it was a tiny heart, something only she and he knew about. And then she looked away, like she had heard something off-screen, and the video cut to static. Jade sat frozen. The room was silent. No one needed to speak. The clip had weight, had fear embedded into every shaky pixel. The detective turned to her slowly and said, "This changed everything. It wasn't just a missing person anymore. It was a woman terrified, leaving a trail in case she vanished. They had a video, they had her voice, they had a timestamp. It placed Mia in Ethan's presence in the weeks before she disappeared, inside what looked exactly like the cabin in Tarry Hollow. The tech team was already matching the interior to the property photos. Jade watched the clip again, this time slower, studying every flicker of her sister's eyes, every tremor in her voice. It was Mia, hurt, afraid, brave, leaving a breadcrumb for a future she wasn't sure she would live to see. Caroline, standing beside Jade, wiped tears from her cheek and whispered that she was so sorry. But Jade didn't cry. Not yet. This wasn't the end. This was a key turning in a lock, a door creaking open, and beyond it was the truth she had chased through years of silence and doubt. Her sister had spoken, had left a piece of herself behind, and now the world had to listen. The interrogation room felt colder now as Jade stepped inside, escorted by an officer who asked one last time if she was sure she wanted to do this, and she nodded without hesitation because, after everything Mia had suffered alone, Jade wasn't going to let this man hide behind lawyers and silence any longer. Ethan looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes that said more than words ever could. She sat across from him, spine straight, heart thudding like a war drum in her chest. The detective allowed the conversation under supervision, silent observers recording every breath, every twitch. Jade didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She simply said her sister's name, Mia. Ethan's jaw shifted slightly, but he said nothing. Jade told him she had seen the video, the one Mia recorded, the one where she said she was scared. She told him about the cabin, about the ring, about the photo. Her voice never rose, but it carried the weight of 10 years of silence sharpened into something dangerous. Ethan leaned back and shrugged, a calculated gesture, and said Mia left, that she had issues, that she couldn't handle pressure, and disappeared. He said people vanish all the time. Sometimes they want to, sometimes they don't. But she was gone, and he had moved on. Jade stared at him, her nails digging into her palms beneath the table, and asked him why he kept the ring, why he gave it to Caroline. If it was just a trinket, or if he needed to own every part of her, even in absence. Ethan didn't answer that. He smiled slightly, a cruel thing that curled without warmth, and asked if she had ever considered that maybe Mia wasn't the person she thought she was, that maybe she ran because of something she did. Jade said no, not once, not ever. Because Mia was kind, brave, too trusting. She didn't run, she was taken. And she had been leaving clues, trying to be found. Jade leaned forward then, closing the space between them just enough, and said if there was anything left in him that resembled humanity, he should tell the truth. Just once, not for redemption, for closure, for her, for Mia. Ethan stared at her for a long time, his mouth opening slightly before closing again. He exhaled slowly, then said something so flat and chilling it hollowed the air. He said she knew what she was getting into. Jade's body went still. The detective stood, signaling the end of the session. Ethan was silent again, retreating behind that familiar wall of arrogance. But it was too late. His words had hung in the room like smoke, and no one missed what they meant. He had admitted enough. Enough to see him for who he really was. Enough to show the monster behind the smile. And Jade walked out of that room knowing the truth was no longer buried. It had spoken, and now it would be heard. The arrest came just after sunrise, quiet and efficient, as unmarked vehicles pulled up to Ethan's apartment and officers emerged with purpose etched into every step, warrant in hand and cuffs ready. He opened the door shirtless, smugness still half-formed on his lips. but it vanished the moment he saw the badge, the paperwork, the unflinching eyes of the lead detective. They read him his rights while neighbors peeked through blinds and phones captured the beginning of a downfall in pixels and silence. Jade stood across the street beside Caroline, wrapped in a coat that suddenly felt too thin, watching as the man who had haunted her memories for a decade was finally brought out into the open. Ethan didn't resist. He didn't speak, but his jaw was tight and his shoulders stiff, like someone still convinced this was a misunderstanding that could be spun into dust. As they placed him into the back of the car, Jade felt something inside her shift. Not relief, not triumph, but a stillness she hadn't known in years. The kind of quiet that comes when the screaming stops. Back at the station, the search team returned from the Tarry Hollow cabin with bags of evidence, scraps of clothing, a bracelet Mia once wore, fragments of a journal hidden beneath floorboards. Enough to paint a picture, enough to say she had been there, enough to show she hadn't left willingly. The cold case was no longer cold. It burned now, alive with leads and momentum. Media picked it up quickly, the narrative spreading across headlines and news tickers, from socialite wedding disaster to tech mogul suspect in missing person case. But none of it felt sensational to Jade. It felt overdue, like the truth had been waiting for the world to turn its head in the right direction. Caroline gave her official statement that same day, unwavering and clear. She handed over access to Ethan's devices, journals, old files he thought no one would ever find. She did not cry when she spoke. She did not tremble. She stood like someone who had seen behind the curtain and survived. Jade watched her with quiet gratitude. Two women, once strangers, now forever tied by a ring, by a truth neither had expected to uncover. As Ethan sat in a holding cell awaiting arraignment, the district attorney confirmed that charges were being drawn up. Obstruction, fraud, and the possibility of homicide if the remaining evidence connected all the pieces. Jade knew the road ahead would not be simple. Cases like this took time. The past did not loosen its grip easily. But for the first time in 10 years, Mia's name was not being spoken with pity or doubt. It was being spoken with purpose, with justice in motion. And as the sun climbed higher above the skyline, casting light over the city that had swallowed so many secrets, Jade let herself believe in something she had buried long ago: hope. Not for a perfect ending, but for truth, and for peace that might finally follow. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters the morning of Ethan's arraignment, microphones jutting forward like spears and voices, calling his name in a frenzy that no longer held admiration but accusation, the kind reserved for fallen idols and exposed predators. Jade stood back from the crowd, hidden behind sunglasses and a wool coat, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want her face to become part of a spectacle. This was not about fame or vengeance. It was about Mia, and as Ethan was led inside, flanked by officers and his lawyer, Jade felt no satisfaction, only a quiet ache that pressed behind her ribs. Inside the courtroom, the air was tense but still, the kind of silence that waited for consequences. Ethan sat stone-faced as the charges were read. Evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, identity fraud, and the looming possibility of a homicide indictment pending results from forensic tests underway at the Tarry Hollow property. His plea was not guilty. Of course it was. But no one in the room looked surprised. The judge set bail at an unreachable figure and denied release, citing flight risk and the disturbing weight of circumstantial evidence. Jade sat through it all, hands clenched in her lap, watching the man who had smiled his way through lies for a decade now stare at the floor like it owed him answers. Afterward, she walked through the long hallway leading out of the building, past marble walls and echoing footsteps, and stepped into the light with a calm she didn't yet understand. Outside, Caroline waited near the edge of the plaza. She said nothing at first, just nodded, and Jade nodded back. They had spoken little since the arrest, but they didn't need to. The bond forged in unraveling something monstrous didn't require words. That night, Jade returned home to find a letter slid under her door. No return address. Inside was a faded photograph. Mia and Jade, arms looped, grinning in the sunday, and a note in Mia's handwriting. It was dated weeks before her disappearance. It said, "If anything ever happens, please don't let the story end with silence." Jade pressed it to her chest and cried, "The kind of tears that come when the world finally begins to hear what you've been screaming inside." She lit a candle beneath Mia's photo on the windowsill, the same ritual she had done for 10 years, but this time the flame didn't flicker alone. It burned with meaning, with movement, with memory turned into action. The city outside pulsed with noise and life, but inside Jade's apartment there was only peace, and the soft rustle of paper as she slid the letter into a new box. One that wouldn't stay buried, because the story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, erased. And now that story was being rewritten out loud. Weeks passed, and though the headlines slowly faded from the front pages, the impact of what had been uncovered didn't disappear. It echoed quietly but steadily in the spaces where silence used to live. The cold case that once collected dust now sat open and active on the desks of 2 dedicated detectives, and Jade received updates regularly. Forensics had confirmed Mia's DNA in the Tarry Hollow cabin. More personal items had been found hidden beneath a false panel in the floorboards, and search teams had expanded the perimeter with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. A case that once had no body and no voice now had both. Jade returned to the cabin once, escorted by officers, and stood in the middle of the main room, where the air still smelled faintly of pine and thyme. She ran her hand along the wood-paneled wall and whispered her sister's name. There were no answers that day, but she left a sunflower on the porch, the kind Mia used to draw in the margins of her journals. Back in the city, Jade's life didn't go back to normal, because normal had never really existed. But something new took root. She returned to work part-time, not because she had to, but because she wanted rhythm, noise, life moving forward. The regulars at the cafe didn't ask questions, though some offered soft smiles that meant everything. Caroline reached out occasionally, and they met once a week at a quiet bookstore downtown, where they said little but read side by side, like 2 people learning how to breathe again. One afternoon, Jade visited a small memorial garden funded by a local advocacy group for victims of unresolved crimes. There, among the rose bushes and stone benches, stood a new plaque. In honor of Mia Brooks, sister, daughter, light never lost. Jade traced the name with her fingers and sat beneath the tree beside it, pulling from her bag the journal she had started. Its pages were filling slowly with stories, some hers, some Mia's, some meant for others who had waited too long to be believed. As the sun slipped through the leaves and the city hummed in the distance, Jade closed her eyes and listened, not for ghosts, but for peace. It didn't come in a roar. It came in quiet, steady breaths, in the certainty that the truth had found its way to the surface. Justice was not a single moment. It was a long road, but she was on it. And with every step, Mia walked beside her. Not gone, not forgotten, but carried forward in memory, in fight, and now, finally, in light. If this story moved you or reminded you that even the smallest voice can spark a reckoning, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below. We read every single one. Your support helps us uncover more untold stories that matter. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next twist, the next truth, or the next voice that refuses to be silenced. And if you know someone carrying questions with no answers, or someone still waiting to be believed, share this video with them. Because sometimes everything can change with one ring, one name, or one brave whisper spoken out loud. Thank you for being here.